Eleanor May Whitfield pressed her face against the dusty window of the stagecoach, watching the endless stretch of golden prairie roll by under the blazing summer sun. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the worn leather handle of her carpetbag, the only possession that held everything she owned in this world. Inside that bag were 3 dresses, her mother's pearl earrings, a small Bible, and most importantly, a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The year was 1887, and Eleanor was 24 years old. Back in Philadelphia, where she had spent her entire life, people whispered that she was becoming an old maid. Her aunts would shake their heads sadly whenever they saw her, making comments about how she had let herself go and how no decent man would want a wife with such a full figure. Eleanor had grown tired of their pitying looks and harsh words about her curves. She wasn't a small woman, that much was true. While other ladies of her age were tiny and delicate like china dolls, Eleanor was what people politely called robust. She had wide hips, a full chest, and soft curves that her corset couldn't quite hide. In the fancy drawing rooms of Philadelphia society, this made her practically invisible to potential suitors. Men would look right through her at parties, as if she wasn't even there, but Eleanor had more to offer than just her appearance. She could read and write beautifully, something many women couldn't do. She knew how to manage a household, cook meals that would make grown men weep with joy, and she had a quick wit that could make people laugh even on their worst days. Her mother had always told her that these qualities mattered more than a tiny waist, but after her mother died 3 years ago, Eleanor began to wonder if anyone would ever see past her size. That's when she heard about the mail-order bride advertisements in the newspaper. Men out west were looking for wives, and they cared more about finding a good woman than finding a perfect figure. Eleanor spent weeks reading these advertisements, looking for someone who seemed kind and genuine. Most of the men wrote things like seeking pretty wife or want young, slim bride, but one advertisement was different. Thomas Brennan from Copper Creek, Wyoming Territory, had written, "Successful merchant seeking wholesome, caring wife for companionship and partnership in building a life together. Beauty fades, but a good heart lasts forever. Looking for intelligence, kindness, and shared dreams of a better future." Eleanor read that advertisement dozens of times. Here was a man who seemed to understand what really mattered. She gathered her courage and wrote her first letter to Thomas, being completely honest about herself. She described her appearance truthfully, writing that she was pleasantly rounded with generous curves and explaining that she might not be the smallest woman, but she had the biggest heart. To her amazement, Thomas wrote back almost immediately. His letters were charming and intelligent. He told her about his general store in Copper Creek, about the beautiful mountains surrounding the small town, and about his dreams of building something meaningful with the right woman. He wrote that he found her honesty refreshing and that her wit came through clearly in her letters. For 6 months, they exchanged letters weekly. Eleanor began to feel like she knew Thomas personally. He told her about his childhood in Ohio, about how he had come west to make his fortune, and about how lonely it got in the evenings after closing his store. Eleanor shared stories about her life in Philadelphia, her love of reading, and her dreams of having a real home with someone who appreciated her. What Eleanor didn't know was that Thomas had given all of his correspondence to his business partner, William Hayes, to handle. William was the one actually reading her letters and writing responses. Thomas was too busy with his expanding business to bother with the details. William, trying to be helpful, had painted a picture of Eleanor in his mind based on what he thought Thomas wanted to hear. In his responses, he emphasized her domestic skills and kind nature while glossing over her honest descriptions of her appearance. Thomas, trusting his partner completely, had formed an image of Eleanor as a petite, delicate woman who would make a perfect society wife for a successful businessman. He had even bragged to other men in town about his beautiful bride-to-be, describing her as refined and lovely based on what William had told him. As the stagecoach bounced along the rough frontier roads, Eleanor rehearsed what she would say when she first met Thomas. She had spent her life savings on this journey, nearly $50 for the train ticket to Wyoming and the stagecoach fare to Copper Creek. The blue silk dress she wore was her finest, carefully altered to fit her figure in the most flattering way possible. She had practiced walking gracefully, holding her head high, and smiling in a way that would make Thomas proud to call her his wife. The other passengers in the stagecoach had been kind to her during the long journey. There was an elderly farmer returning home with his wife, a young cowboy heading to a new job, and a traveling salesman with endless stories about life on the frontier. They had all listened with interest when Eleanor explained that she was traveling to meet her intended husband. The farmer's wife had even helped her fix her hair that morning, saying that any man would be lucky to have such a sweet and capable woman. Eleanor felt a mixture of excitement and terror as the stagecoach finally began to slow down. Through the dusty window, she could see the wooden buildings of Copper Creek coming into view. The town was smaller than she had imagined, with a main street lined with simple storefronts and houses. She could see Thomas's general store, exactly as he had described it in his letters, with his name painted proudly across the front window. Her heart pounded as she thought about stepping off this stagecoach and meeting the man she planned to marry in just a few hours. Thomas had arranged for them to wed immediately upon her arrival, as was common with mail-order bride arrangements. The preacher was expecting them, and Thomas had written that he had even invited some of the townspeople to witness their union. Eleanor smoothed down her dress one more time and checked her reflection in the small mirror she kept in her bag. Her brown hair was neatly pinned up, her cheeks had a healthy glow from the journey, and her green eyes sparkled with hope. She might not be the smallest woman in the world, but she was clean, well-dressed, and ready to be the best wife she could possibly be. The stagecoach driver called out that they had reached Copper Creek, and Eleanor's stomach fluttered with butterflies. This was it, the moment that would change her entire life. She had left behind everything familiar and traveled over 1,000 miles to start fresh with a man who had promised to value her for who she truly was. As the stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the small wooden church where Thomas had promised to meet her, Eleanor whispered a quick prayer. She asked for courage, for Thomas to be pleased with her appearance, and for their marriage to be filled with the happiness they had both dreamed about in their letters. Eleanor had knowing that in just a few minutes her dreams would be shattered in the cruelest way possible. She had no idea that Thomas was expecting someone completely different, or that the entire town was about to witness what would become the most humiliating moment of her life. But sometimes life has a way of leading us exactly where we need to be, even when the journey breaks our hearts first. Thomas Brennan stood at the altar of the small wooden church, tugging at his collar nervously as sweat beaded on his forehead. The July heat was stifling inside the cramped building, but that wasn't the only reason he felt uncomfortable. Nearly half the town had crowded into the wooden pews to witness this wedding. Word had spread quickly about the mail-order bride arriving from back east, and everyone was curious to see what kind of woman would travel so far to marry a man she'd never met. Thomas checked his pocket watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The stagecoach should have arrived by now. He had dressed in his finest black suit, the one he usually saved for Sundays and special occasions. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade, and he had even trimmed his mustache that morning. At 31, Thomas considered himself quite a catch in Copper Creek. His general store was the most successful business in town, and he owned a fine house on the hill overlooking the main street. The townspeople whispered excitedly behind him. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, leaned over to whisper to her neighbor about how romantic it all was. Old Pete from the saloon had made jokes about Thomas being brave enough to marry a woman sight unseen. Even the children seemed fascinated by the idea of a bride arriving on the stagecoach. Like something out of a storybook, Thomas had bragged plenty about his bride-to-be over the past few weeks. Based on what his business partner William had told him about Eleanor's letters, he had painted quite a picture for the townspeople. He described her as refined, educated, and lovely. Exactly the kind of sophisticated woman who would make a perfect wife for a successful businessman like himself. He had even hinted that she came from a wealthy Philadelphia family and was used to the finer things in life. The truth was, Thomas had barely read any of Eleanor's actual letters. Running his store took up most of his time, and he had trusted William completely to handle the correspondence. William had summarized the letters for him, focusing on Eleanor's domestic skills and pleasant personality while glossing over her detailed descriptions of her appearance. Thomas had formed his own image of what Eleanor must look like: petite, delicate, and fashionable, like the society ladies he had admired from afar during his brief time in Denver. Reverend Collins, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, stood ready with his Bible open to the marriage ceremony. He had performed dozens of weddings in his 20 years in Copper Creek, but even he seemed excited about this unusual union. The whole situation felt like something out of one of those romantic novels that the ladies in town passed around secretly. Suddenly, the church doors creaked open and every head turned to look. Thomas felt his heart race with anticipation as he prepared to see his bride for the first time. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the doorway, creating a silhouette of a woman's figure. For a moment, Thomas couldn't make out the details, and he smiled broadly, ready to greet the woman who would become his wife. Then Eleanor stepped fully into the church, and Thomas felt the smile freeze on his face. The woman walking down the aisle was nothing like what he had imagined. Instead of the petite, delicate figure he had expected, Eleanor was a full-figured woman with generous curves that her blue silk dress couldn't hide. She was taller than he had pictured, with wide hips and a full bosom that strained slightly against her carefully fitted bodice. Her face was pretty enough, with kind green eyes and smooth skin, but she was so different from his expectations that Thomas felt like he was looking at a complete stranger. A murmur rippled through the congregation as the townspeople got their first look at the mail-order bride. Some of the whispers weren't entirely kind. Mrs. Henderson, known for her sharp tongue, made a comment about Eleanor being quite substantial that carried further than she probably intended. A few of the men exchanged glances that clearly said they wouldn't have chosen such a bride themselves. Eleanor seemed to sense the change in atmosphere immediately. Her confident smile began to waver as she noticed Thomas's shocked expression and heard the whispers from the pews. She had expected some nervousness, but the look on Thomas's face wasn't nervous excitement. It was pure disappointment, maybe even disgust. Thomas felt trapped. Every eye in the church was on him, waiting to see what he would do. His mind raced as he tried to figure out how this had happened. Hadn't Eleanor described herself accurately in her letters? Hadn't William told him she was attractive? He felt deceived and embarrassed, standing there in front of the entire town with a bride who looked nothing like what he had led everyone to expect. Eleanor continued walking slowly down the aisle, her carpet-bag clutched tightly in one hand and a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked that morning in the other. With each step, she could see more clearly that something was terribly wrong. Thomas wasn't looking at her with love or even acceptance. He was looking at her like she was some kind of mistake that needed to be corrected. When Eleanor reached the altar, she stood there waiting for Thomas to take her hand or say something welcoming. Instead, Thomas took a step backward, his face pale and his mouth set in a hard line. The silence in the church was deafening. Even the children had stopped fidgeting, sensing that something important and uncomfortable was happening. Finally, Thomas found his voice, but what came out wasn't what anyone expected to hear at a wedding ceremony. "Reverend Collins," Thomas said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I'm afraid there's been some kind of mistake here." Eleanor felt her heart drop into her stomach. The words hit her like a physical blow, and she had to grip her bouquet tighter to keep her hands from shaking. "What kind of mistake, son?" Reverend Collins asked quietly, trying to keep his voice low, though in the small church everyone could hear every word. Thomas looked around the church at all the expectant faces, then back at Eleanor. His next words would be remembered and repeated in Copper Creek for years to come. "This woman," Thomas said, gesturing toward Eleanor as if she were an object rather than a person, "is not what was described to me. I was led to believe I was getting a different kind of wife entirely. I cannot, in good conscience, marry someone who has clearly misrepresented herself so completely." The gasps from the congregation were audible. Mrs. Patterson actually put her hand over her heart as if she might faint. The children stared wide-eyed. Not fully understanding what was happening, but knowing it wasn't good, Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. In all her fears about this meeting, she had never imagined anything this cruel. She had been completely honest in her letters, describing herself exactly as she was. If there had been any misunderstanding, it wasn't because she had lied. "Thomas," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wrote to you exactly what I looked like. I never tried to deceive you about anything." But Thomas was already shaking his head, his embarrassment turning to anger. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I won't be made a fool of in front of my neighbors and friends. I will not marry a woman who has clearly tried to trick me into this arrangement." The cruelty of his words hit Eleanor like physical blows. She had traveled over 1,000 miles, spent every penny she had, and put her heart on the line for this man. And now he was rejecting her publicly in front of a church full of strangers, calling her a liar and a deceiver. Thomas turned to address the congregation, as if Eleanor wasn't even there. "I apologize to all of you for this embarrassing situation. Obviously, there will be no wedding today. I suggest everyone return to their regular activities." With that, Thomas Brennan walked out of his own wedding, leaving Eleanor standing alone at the altar in her blue silk dress, holding wilted wildflowers with 50 pairs of eyes staring at her in shock and pity. The humiliation was complete and devastating. Eleanor had never felt so small and worthless in her entire life, despite being the largest woman in the room. Eleanor stood frozen at the altar, her wilted wildflowers trembling in her hands as the church buzzed with shocked whispers. The wooden pews creaked as people shifted uncomfortably, not sure whether to leave or stay. Some folks stared at her with open curiosity, others looked away in embarrassment, and a few seemed to be enjoying the drama of it all. Eleanor felt like she was drowning in a sea of pitying looks and harsh judgments. Mrs. Henderson leaned over to whisper something to her neighbor, and Eleanor caught the words "poor thing" and "what will she do now?" The banker's wife shook her head sadly, while old Pete from the saloon just sat there with his mouth hanging open, probably already planning how he'd tell this story to anyone who'd listen. Eleanor's mind raced as the reality of her situation hit her like a slap in the face. She was stranded in a town where she knew absolutely nobody, with less than $3 left in her purse after paying for the stagecoach. The return trip to Philadelphia would cost far more than she had, and even if she could afford it, what would she go back to? Her aunt's house, where she'd be reminded daily of this failure. The whispers and pitying looks of people who had always seen her as the spinster who couldn't catch a husband. Reverend Collins cleared his throat awkwardly, still holding his Bible, but clearly unsure what to do with it now. "Well, folks," he said in a voice that tried to sound normal but came out strained, "I suppose we should all head on home now. Nothing more to see here," but nobody moved. The townspeople seemed glued to their seats, fascinated by this real-life drama playing out right in front of them. Eleanor realized they were all waiting to see what she would do next. Would she break down and cry? Would she beg Thomas to reconsider? Would she simply collapse from the shame of it all? Eleanor surprised them all, including herself. Instead of crumbling, she lifted her chin and straightened her shoulders. Her mother had always taught her that dignity was something no one could take away from you unless you let them. And Eleanor May Whitfield was not about to let Brennan or anyone else in this room steal her dignity. "Thank you, Reverend," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the small church. "I appreciate you taking the time to prepare for today's ceremony. I'm sorry it was wasted." She turned to face the congregation, her green eyes bright, with unshed tears but her voice steady. "And thank you all for coming to witness what you thought would be a joyful occasion. I hope you'll remember that sometimes people make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes hurt innocent folks. I pray none of you ever have to experience what I felt today." With that, Eleanor began walking back down the aisle, her head held high despite the burning shame in her chest. Each step felt like walking through thick mud, but she kept going. She would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break down. She would not let Thomas Brennan's cruelty destroy her completely. As she walked, Eleanor tried to figure out what to do next. The boarding house, if there even was one in a town this small, would cost money she didn't have. She couldn't sleep in the street, and she certainly couldn't stay in that church. Maybe she could find work somewhere, anything that would let her earn enough money to eventually leave this place and start over somewhere else. That's when she noticed him. In the very back pew, almost hidden in the shadows, sat a man who hadn't been whispering or staring like the others. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years working outdoors. His brown hair was slightly too long and looked like he'd tried to comb it down for the occasion but hadn't quite succeeded. He wore a clean but well-worn shirt and pants that had seen plenty of work, and his hat rested on his knee. What struck Eleanor most about this stranger was the way he was looking at her. While everyone else stared with curiosity or pity, this man's dark eyes held something different. There was kindness there, and what looked almost like anger, but not anger at her. Anger at what had just happened to her. As Eleanor reached the back of the church, the man stood up. He was taller than she had realized, probably 6 feet or more, with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. But despite his size, there was something gentle about the way he moved, like he was being careful not to startle a wounded animal. "Ma'am," he said quietly, removing his hat and holding it respectfully in front of him. His voice was deep and rough around the edges, like he didn't use it much for talking to people. "I'm real sorry about what just happened in there. That was no way to treat a lady, especially not in front of all these folks." Eleanor looked up into his face and saw genuine sympathy there. After the cruelty she had just experienced, this small kindness almost broke through her carefully maintained composure. "Thank you," she managed to say. "That's very kind of you." The man glanced back toward the front of the church where people were finally starting to file out, their voices rising as they began discussing what they had just witnessed. He seemed to make a decision, then looked back at Eleanor. "Name's Jacob Morrison," he said. "I run a cattle ranch about 5 miles north of here. Came into town today for supplies and heard there was a wedding, so I thought I'd pay my respects." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I don't mean to be forward, ma'am, and you can tell me to mind my own business if you want, but it seems to me you might be in need of a place to stay and some honest work." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Was this man offering her charity? The thought made her want to refuse immediately. She had her pride, after all, but then reality crashed back down on her. Pride wouldn't put food in her stomach or a roof over her head. "What kind of work?" she asked carefully. Jacob shifted his hat from one hand to the other, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention as more people walked past them on their way out of the church. "Well, I live alone out there, and I'm not much good at keeping house or cooking proper meals. Been living mostly on beans and hardtack for months now. The place needs a woman's touch, if you'll pardon me saying so. I could use someone to manage the household, do the cooking and cleaning, maybe help with the books since I'm not much good with numbers either." He was offering her a job, Eleanor realized. Not charity, but honest work. The relief was almost overwhelming. "I'd pay fair wages," Jacob continued, "and you'd have your own room in the house. It's not fancy, mind you, just a simple ranch house, but it's clean and sturdy. You'd be safe there, I give you my word on that." Eleanor studied his face carefully. She had just learned the hard way that she couldn't always trust what men told her, but something about Jacob Morrison seemed different. Maybe it was the way he kept his distance, being respectful of her space. Maybe it was how he looked her straight in the eye when he spoke, not letting his gaze wander over her figure like so many men did. Or maybe it was simply that he was treating her like a human being deserving of respect, something she hadn't experienced much of in her 24 years. "I'm a hard worker," Eleanor said finally. "I can cook, clean, sew, and manage a household. I can read and write and handle numbers just fine. I don't drink, I don't gossip, and I don't cause trouble." Jacob nodded. "That's more than I dared hope. If you're willing, I can take you out to the ranch today. You can see the place and decide if it suits you." Eleanor looked around the church one more time. Most of the townspeople had left by now, probably rushing home to spread the story of the mail-order bride who got rejected at the altar. Thomas was long gone, probably back at his store trying to pretend this whole embarrassing episode had never happened. She had come to Copper Creek expecting to start a new life as Thomas Brennan's wife. That dream was dead and buried. But maybe, just maybe, she could still build something good from the ashes of this disaster. "Mr. Morrison," Eleanor said, extending her hand to shake his, "I believe I'd like to see your ranch." 3 months had passed since that terrible day at the church, and Eleanor barely recognized her own life anymore. The woman who had once felt ashamed of her reflection now hummed cheerfully as she kneaded bread dough in the warm kitchen of Jacob's ranch house. The morning sun streamed through clean windows that she had scrubbed until they sparkled, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. The Morrison Ranch had been a bachelor's home when Eleanor first arrived, and it showed. Dust covered every surface, dishes sat dirty in the sink for days at a time, and Jacob had been sleeping on a mattress that looked like it hadn't seen fresh sheets in months. The poor man had been living like a hermit, eating nothing but beans, salt pork, and stale bread when he remembered to eat at all. Eleanor had rolled up her sleeves and gotten to work immediately. Within a week she had transformed the little ranch house into something that actually felt like a home. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, organized the pantry, and even planted a small garden behind the house where she grew vegetables and herbs. The curtains she sewed from fabric Jacob bought her in town added warmth and color to rooms that had been nothing but bare wood and functional furniture. But it wasn't just the house that had changed. Eleanor herself was becoming a different person than the nervous, rejected bride who had stepped off that stagecoach. Out here on the ranch, away from the judging eyes and whispered comments of town society, she discovered parts of herself she never knew existed. When one of Jacob's horses came down with colic in her second week there, Eleanor didn't hesitate. To help, she held the animal's head while Jacob worked, speaking to the frightened horse in soothing tones until the crisis passed. Jacob had looked at her with surprise and gratitude, saying he'd never met a city woman who wasn't afraid of large animals. "I'm not really a city woman," Eleanor had replied with a laugh. "I just happen to live in the city." That became a pattern. Whenever Jacob faced challenges on the ranch, Eleanor found ways to help that surprised both of them. She proved to have a natural head for numbers, organizing his chaotic record-keeping system and showing him exactly how much money he was losing by not keeping track of his expenses properly. She figured out which cattle were the most profitable and which ones were costing him more than they were worth. During the fall roundup, when Jacob was short-handed because one of his hired men had broken his arm, Eleanor shocked everyone by insisting she could help drive cattle. The other ranch hands laughed at first, thinking this curvy woman from Philadelphia would be thrown from her horse within minutes. Instead, Eleanor proved to be a natural rider with an instinct for managing livestock that impressed even the most experienced cowboys. "Where'd you learn to ride like that?" Jacob had asked her that evening as they sat on the porch, both tired, but satisfied after a successful day of moving cattle to winter pasture. Eleanor smiled, remembering, "My uncle had a small farm outside Philadelphia when I was little. One spent summers there until I was 12. I guess some things you never forget, even when you think you have." Jacob was discovering all sorts of surprising things about Eleanor. The woman who had been rejected for being too plain and too large was actually incredibly capable and intelligent. She could fix a broken harness, treat a sick chicken, balance account books, and cook meals that made his hired hands beg to stay. For dinner, she had a quick wit that could make him laugh even after the hardest days, and a practical wisdom that helped him solve problems he'd been struggling with for years. More than that, Eleanor was changing the very atmosphere of the ranch. Before she arrived, the Morrison place had felt like a work camp where Jacob happened to sleep. Now it felt like a real home. She had a way of making everyone feel welcome, from the seasonal workers who came for roundup to the traveling preacher, who stopped by once a month. She remembered their names, asked about their families, and always made sure there was enough food for unexpected guests. Jacob found himself looking forward to the end, of each workday in a way he never had before. Coming home used to mean falling into bed exhausted and alone. Now it meant walking into a house filled with delicious smells and warm light, where Eleanor would greet him with a smile and ask about his day while she served him meals that were better than anything he'd ever eaten in any restaurant. But it was the quiet evening conversations that Jacob treasured most. After dinner, they would sit on the porch or by the fireplace, and Eleanor would tell him stories about her life back east, or share something funny that had happened with the chickens that day. She was an excellent listener, too, genuinely interested. In his thoughts about ranching, his dreams for expanding the operation, and even his worries about market prices and weather patterns, slowly. Almost without realizing it, Jacob began to see Eleanor not just as his capable housekeeper, but as his partner in building something meaningful. When he talked about his plans for the future, he started saying "we" instead of "I," without even thinking about it. When neighbors came by and saw how well the ranch was running, they began referring to Jacob and Eleanor as a team, assuming they were married. Eleanor noticed the change too. Jacob had started asking for her opinion on important decisions, treating her input as valuable rather than just being polite. When the banker came out to discuss a loan for new equipment, Jacob had Eleanor sit in on the meeting, introducing her as someone who knows more about the numbers than I do. When cattle buyers came around, Jacob made sure Eleanor was there to help with negotiations. Knowing she had a better eye for detail than he did, the physical attraction between them grew slowly and naturally. Jacob began noticing the way Eleanor's hair caught the light when she worked in the garden, the grace with which she moved despite her full figure, the way her green eyes sparkled when she laughed at his jokes. He found himself lingering in the kitchen during breakfast, not because he needed more coffee, but because he enjoyed watching Eleanor move confidently around the space she had made her own. Eleanor, meanwhile, began to see Jacob as more than just her kind employer. She noticed the gentle way he handled injured animals, the fairness with which he treated his workers, the quiet strength that made her feel safe and protected. When he came in exhausted from a hard day's work, she found herself wanting to smooth the worry lines from his forehead. When he smiled at something she said, her heart did little flips that reminded her she was still a woman with a woman's feelings, despite what Thomas Brennan had made her believe about herself. The turning point came on a cold October evening when Jacob found Eleanor crying quietly by the kitchen window. She had received a letter from her aunt in Philadelphia, full of gossip about her shameful situation and demands to know when she planned to come home and stop living in sin with a man who wasn't her husband. "What's wrong?" Jacob asked gently, offering her his handkerchief. Eleanor wiped her eyes, embarrassed to be caught crying. "My aunt thinks I'm ruining what's left of my reputation by working here. She says decent women don't live alone with men they're not married to, even if nothing improper is happening." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, then sat down across from her at the kitchen table. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "I hope you know that I respect you completely. I would never do anything to harm your reputation or make you uncomfortable." "I know that," Eleanor said quickly. "You've been nothing but kind and honorable. It's just ... Sometimes I wonder if she's right. Maybe I should be trying harder to find a husband, or at least making plans to move on somewhere else eventually." Jacob felt his heart sink at the thought of Eleanor leaving. The ranch, his life, everything felt empty when he imagined it without her. And that's when he realized he had fallen in love with the woman Thomas Brennan had been fool enough to reject. "Eleanor," Jacob said, his voice rough with emotion, "what if you didn't have to leave? What if there was a way for you to stay here permanently? As my partner and everything, not just my housekeeper?" Eleanor looked up at him through her tears, hardly daring to hope she understood what he was suggesting. "What I'm trying to say," Jacob continued, reaching across the table to take her hand, "is that I've fallen in love with you. Not just with your cooking or your help with the ranch, but with you. Your laugh, your kindness, your intelligence. Everything that makes you who you are. I know I'm not much to look at and I'm not wealthy like some men, but if you'd consider it, I'd be honored to call you my wife." 1 year and 3 months after the most humiliating day of her life, Eleanor stood in front of the same cracked mirror in the back room of Copper Creek's little church, but this time everything was different. The woman looking back at her was nothing like the nervous, desperate bride who had arrived on the stagecoach that terrible summer day. This Eleanor had sun-kissed skin from working outdoors, confident eyes that sparkled with genuine happiness, and a smile that came from deep inside her heart. The dress she wore today was one. She had sewn herself from beautiful cream-colored fabric that Jacob had special ordered from Denver. It wasn't the fancy silk gown she had worn for Thomas, but it was infinitely more precious because it represented her new life. She had designed it to fit her curves perfectly, no longer trying to hide her full figure, but celebrating it as part of who she was. The bodice was fitted but comfortable, the skirt full enough to move easily, and she had even added tiny pearl buttons that had belonged to her mother. Eleanor's hair was pinned up, with small wildflowers that she had picked at, morning from the garden she had planted behind Jacob's house. Her face glowed with health and happiness, and for the first time in her life, she truly felt beautiful. Not because she looked different, but because she finally saw herself through the eyes of someone who loved her completely. The church was filling up again, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of curious strangers waiting to judge her, the pews held people who had become her friends and neighbors over the past year. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, had helped Eleanor with her hair that morning and kept dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief. Old Pete from the saloon had sobered up especially for the occasion and even bought a new shirt. The ranch hands who worked for Jacob were there in their cleanest clothes, grinning like proud brothers. Even Reverend Collins seemed more relaxed this time. He had gotten to know both Eleanor and Jacob over the past months, watching their relationship grow from mutual respect into deep love. He had seen how Eleanor had transformed not just Jacob's ranch, but the whole community, bringing people together with her warm hospitality and generous heart. The biggest difference was in the front pew, where Thomas Brennan sat alone, looking distinctly uncomfortable. His general store had failed 6 months earlier when a larger competitor opened up in the next town over. His fine house on the hill was for sale, and word around town was that he would be leaving Copper Creek soon with more debts than assets. The man who had once considered himself too good for Eleanor was now watching her marry the most respected and successful rancher in the county, but Eleanor barely noticed Thomas. She had forgiven him months ago, not because he deserved it, but because holding on to anger was taking up space in her heart that she wanted to fill with better things. If Thomas hadn't rejected her so cruelly, she never would have found Jacob, and she couldn't imagine her life without him now. Through the window, Eleanor could see Jacob's wagon pulling up outside, and her heart started beating faster with excitement, rather than nerves. This time, she wasn't marrying a stranger based on letters and dreams. She was marrying her best friend, her partner, the man who had seen her at her lowest point and helped her discover her strength. Jacob climbed down from the wagon wearing a new black suit that Eleanor had convinced him to buy in Denver. He had protested the expense, saying his old Sunday clothes were good enough, but Eleanor had insisted that their wedding day deserved something special. He had grumbled about the fancy clothes, but she had caught him admiring himself in the mirror that morning when he thought she wasn't looking. Eleanor heard Jacob's boots on the wooden steps of the church, heard him greeting people as he made his way inside. Her stomach fluttered with anticipation, but it was the good kind of nervousness that came from joy, not fear. Of Mrs. Henderson, who had whispered cruel things about Eleanor at her first almost wedding, knocked gently on the door. "Eleanor, dear, are you ready? Jacob's here, and he looks like he's about to jump out of his skin with excitement." Eleanor smiled and smoothed down her skirt one last time. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it completely. When the church doors opened and Eleanor stepped inside, the reaction was entirely different from the first time. Instead of shocked gasps, there were warm smiles and happy tears. Instead of whispers of judgment, there were murmurs of approval and affection. Mrs. Patterson actually clapped her hands together in delight, and one of the ranch hands let out a quiet, "Ain't she beautiful?" that made everyone chuckle, but Eleanor only had eyes for Jacob, who stood at the altar looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. His face lit up with such pure love and admiration that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. This was what it felt like to be truly wanted, truly valued, truly loved. As Eleanor walked down the aisle, she remembered the journey that had brought her to this moment. The pain of Thomas's rejection, the kindness of Jacob's offer, the hard work of building a new life, the slow growth of friendship into love. Every difficult step had been worth it to reach this moment. When she reached the altar, Jacob took her hands in his calloused, work-roughened ones and smiled so widely that the corners of his eyes crinkled. "You look absolutely beautiful," he whispered, just for her to hear. "So do you," Eleanor whispered back, and meant it. Jacob's weathered face, his kind eyes, his gentle smile, to her, he was the most handsome man in the world. Reverend Collins cleared his throat and began the ceremony, but Eleanor barely heard the traditional words. She was too focused on Jacob's face, on the promises they were making to each other, on the life they were pledging to build together. When it came time for vows, Jacob spoke first, his voice steady and sure. "Eleanor, when you first came to Copper Creek, I thought I was just offering you a job. I had no idea I was inviting the missing piece of my life to come home. You've made my house into a home, my work into a partnership, and my lonely existence into a life worth living. I promise to love you, respect you, and stand by your side through whatever comes our way." Eleanor's voice was clear and strong when she replied, "Jacob, you saw my worth when I couldn't see it myself. You gave me a chance to prove what I could do, and a place where I could become who I was meant to be. You loved me not despite my flaws, but because of everything that makes me who I am. I promise to be your partner in all things, to support your dreams, and to love you with my whole heart for the rest of my life." When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob's kiss was gentle and full of promise. The congregation erupted in cheers and applause, but Eleanor barely heard them. She was too busy marveling at how perfectly right this moment felt. At the wedding celebration that followed, held at the ranch house that was now truly their home, Eleanor moved through the crowd of well-wishers feeling like she was floating on air. The tables groaned under the weight of food that the neighbor women had contributed, and even the men who had initially doubted whether a city woman could make it on a ranch now spoke of Eleanor with genuine respect and affection. As the evening wound down and the last guest departed, Jacob and Eleanor stood together on their porch, looking out over the land they would work together, the life they would build together. "Do you ever think about that day when Thomas left you at the altar?" Jacob asked, his arm around Eleanor's waist. Eleanor smiled and leaned into her husband's warmth. "Sometimes," she said, "but only to be grateful. If he had married me, I would have spent my life trying to be small enough for a small man's dreams. Instead, I found someone who sees me as I really am and loves me for it." Jacob turned to face her fully, his hands framing her face. "Thomas Brennan was the biggest fool in Wyoming territory. His loss was the greatest gift of my life." As Jacob kissed his wife under the starlit sky, Eleanor reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Copper Creek looking for a husband and found so much more. She had found herself, her strength, her purpose, and a love deeper than anything she had ever dreamed possible. The mail-order bride, who had been abandoned for her curves, had become the most envied wife in Copper Creek, not because of how she looked, but because of how deeply and completely she was loved.